My name is Donna Meehan, and I would like to introduce Rose Lathrop, the new Executive Director of Clipchamp Community Land Trust. Rose has been on the job just for 6 weeks, but is not new to the housing issues in Bellingham. She has had over 20 years working experience in both public and private housing. She also serves on the City Planning Commission. Clipchamp CLT, or Community Land Trust, is a nonprofit organization which provides housing ownership to residents who meet the income requirements of people at 80% or below of the median income of the area. Currently, also, only 1/3 of the population of Bellingham can afford to purchase a home in today's market. To explain how a land trust operates, Clipchamp owns the land and provides a 99-year ground lease to the homeowner for the structure, also called a limited equity interest. The homeowner can sell the equity interest, and the new owner takes ownership of the home subject to the 99-year lease. Currently, Clipchamp has 142 homes in the trust. There are new homes being built together with Habitat for Humanity in Ferndale and in the Telegraph Townhomes area in Bellingham. Because of technical difficulties, we are starting Rose's presentation in the middle of it. So please, but you will be able to hear most of her presentation and learn a lot. My question had to do with what's coming up in the legislature that we should be aware of.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is a really, it's a big year. Actually, the Whatcom Housing Alliance, Whatcom Housing Alliance recently had a presentation from Dan Bartlett. One second here. And they described from Sightline as it's an advocacy and communications organization in Washington State. And they do a lot of work in housing policy. So there's a recording of that really kind of outline a couple of the things that they're looking at in terms of housing policy. And I think one of the big ones that you'll see is around parking. And so a lot of cities have developed their parking standards around this International Transportation Engineers Manual. And this manual is very old, and it actually is very outdated in terms of what the policies are within there. And then cities can apply those policies however they want. So if you look at, every city has a different, like for a bowling alley in Whatcom County, every city has a different requirement of the number of parking stalls you need to have for each bowling lane you have. It's very arbitrary in a lot of instances. And that parking needs are different in different parts of the city. So if you're closer to downtown or an urban village, there are less people that are likely to have cars, and more young people are not driving. It was amazing to me, when I turned 16, it was like I could not wait to get my hands on the wheel. And then when my daughter turned 16, she just didn't care. She was happy to just take the bus, walk, and a bunch of her friends were like that. And they still are to this day. She lived down in Portland, and nobody has cars. They all do car shares and, use transit. Cars are expensive, and they, take up a lot of space. I think mostly they're just expensive, and there's so many alternatives out there that they're not driving anymore. So we want to be able to sort of right size parking. And so I think that's going to be a big thing that's going to come forward, both at the state legislature as well as the city of Bellingham. I know their city staff has been doing an evaluation of what are the right changes that we could make, so that, right now, most every development project is asking for some sort of parking waiver. And that's not to say build no parking. People need parking. And in terms of and to market and sell homes and rent apartments, you know, most people here in Bellingham, because we're not Portland and we don't have car shares and we don't have all of that infrastructure yet, most people still do have cars. And so I don't think we're going to see development projects with no parking. It just means that they get to decide how much is the right amount for their development and where they're going to develop. So the farther away from town, you're probably going to see a lot more parking than you would as you get closer and closer, where you can walk to the grocery stores and restaurants and things like that. I think parking is going to be a really big one in the next couple of years. The thing that from Colshan Community Land Trust's perspective is that this is going to be a really big year in terms of a budget for Washington State. We have a $5 billion deficit this year, which is a pretty huge amount. But the housing need is so great that it's like the highest, you know, the highest and most important need, maybe next to climate. So, you know, we're really going to be advocating for as much funding as possible so that we can continue to do our development projects. For example, the Housing Trust Fund, they had $94 million worth of asks for $17 million worth of funding this year. So that's just to say, like, there's a lot of folks like Colshan out there trying to build the homes that we need at an affordable price, and we need those subsidies, and there just isn't enough money out there. So we need to do some serious work in terms of budget advocacy this year.
Okay, Brian and Mary Lynn both have their hands up, so whichever one of you wants to go first.
Go ahead, Brian.
Mary Lynn, go ahead. I've
Okay.
asked a question before.
Okay, I'm Elaine. We're here with Mary Lynn.
Oh,
Just wanted
okay.
to interject. Rose, were you aware that for a while up at Western there was a zip car lot? It didn't go anywhere, but for a while it was just the right thing too early. But
Yep.
it was a bit of an attempt.
Yeah, well, and what we've heard from car share organizations and companies is that Bellingham has just too much parking and it's too convenient for us right now. So we won't see that until it's harder. So when people don't change their transportation modes, incentives don't work. But inconvenience does. So if it gets too expensive and it's too hard to find a parking spot where you drive around and you end up parking blocks and blocks away from wherever you're going anyways, you're like, well, if I would have just taken the bus, I could have got right to where I wanted to go anyway. And the cost of parking, those are the things that are going to do mode shift. And so I think when we see an increase in, you know, inconvenience and a little bit of a, you know, it's gonna get harder. And that's just a fact that we have to deal with, is that we only have so much land. And so the more we grow, we have to consider, do we want places for people or do we want places for cars? And I think that's at the crux of the issue is really, do we want more homes or more parking stalls?
Okay, Brian, and then we'll go back to Shenandoah had a question on the chat.
Rose, I totally support your comments about our downtown should be a place for people and not vehicles. And some of you may know I co-chaired the Bellingham Transportation Fund renewal in 2020, and I'm aware of a lot of active transportation. So I'm excited for the mayor's new selection of a public works director. I think maybe we'll see some different directions than the predecessor. But my question related to housing, since we're on the planning commission, could you just characterize maybe how you see kind of public attitudes changing related to, you know, building a ADU or an ADU? You know, if you go back a number of years, there were some in our community that was, oh my gosh, the sky is falling. People are going to be building massive ADUs. There won't be any street parking, et cetera, et cetera. but that seems to have quieted down. So I'm just curious about your perspective of how community attitudes have changed related to increased density.
It's a really great question. I think the reality is we have seen a dramatic shift. And part of that is having pro-housing voices. So many of you have probably heard the term NIMBY, which is the not in my backyard. Like, yes, we need a homeless shelter, just as long as it's not near where I live. We need these services, we need affordability, as long as it's not where I live. And so I think that's one of the things that we've seen a dramatic shift in our community as what we call YIMBY voices, which is the yes in my backyard. And so in 2018, the city council adopted, was when we first allowed for detached accessory dwelling units. So that's your little mother-in-law in the back of your house. But when they did that, in order to get it passed, I mean, this was the most it was the most wild planning meetings that you'd ever seen, like people busting into song, and it was really incredible because it was the first time that we had a lot of people show up in support of something. Most of the time people show up because they don't want to see something. And so 2018, I think, was like the beginning of a big shift around housing in Bellingham. And then now we've gone so far from like when you could have an ADU, but it has to be owner occupied, and it can only be 66% of the existing house, and it has to look like the existing house, and you have to get all of your neighbors to approve and say that it's okay, and you have to have good parking for every single unit on there. And the rules were very, very onerous. And now you can have 2 ADUs, they can be 1,000 square feet, they can look whatever you want them to look like, and you can condominiumize them and sell them off if you want to. So this is a dramatic shift, and part of this is from the state. The other thing that really came about in the like late teens was more conversations around equitable housing policy, around redlining, and creating more diverse and socioeconomically diverse communities. And so we had a lot of those NIMBY voices that were saying, I don't want my neighborhood to change. And I think a lot of that was to say, I don't want other people living in my neighborhood. And who are those other people that they're afraid to move into their neighborhood? And so, redlining was sort of how our neighborhoods became exclusive from the very beginning. And so, we're saying, and there are parts, and this kind of feeds into Shenandoah's question, there are parts of our community that had covenants that you could not be a person of color and live in those neighborhoods. You couldn't, the York neighborhood, the Eldridge neighborhood, all, several parts of lettered streets. You couldn't be a person of color and live there, and certainly not own a home there. You could be a servant in those neighborhoods. And so what we saw is that like this was what happened is a lot of people were saying, you know what? By making our neighborhoods more exclusive, by not allowing more housing types that used to be allowed before the 50s, the 20s, we saw all kinds of ADUs and duplexes and triplexes. You could only build this type of house in this neighborhood. What happened is that we created these very exclusive neighborhoods, and that excludes people of color, that excludes people of lower socioeconomic means. And once that sort of really became part of the conversation around urban planning, around zoning, I think it quieted some of those voices that realized like, oh, am I part of the problem of this, racial issues? And so as those issues became more prevalent in, locally and nationally, I think we've seen a lot of shift in sort of the mindset around infill. And we still have folks that think ADUs are not the solution, and they're certainly not the only solution, but they are a solution. as my own lived experience here of being able to, I actually moved a house from the lettered streets neighborhood that was going to be torn down. I put it into my backyard. So I saved a house and also now created a little bit more wealth for myself, and my daughter made it through college. Yeah.
Okay. Shenandoah, you had a comment on that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm
This-
just wondering whether or not this is, I know that there's a couple Native Americans like Lummi, I think, that are over in the Telegraph townhomes.
Right.
The Covenant Homeownership Act wasn't around, I think, when they were buying their homes, but do we have anybody else in our waiting list that does qualify for that? And then I also thought, how would it qualify? Would it qualify? Because it's 20% or a maximum of $150,000.
Yep.
So I'm wondering, would the funds qualify on the fair market value of the home, or would it qualify on what it's being sold to the buyer for?
I think it's what it's being sold to the buyer for.
Which sucks.
But maybe, just to give like a really high level, Washington State recently, there's the Black Homeownership Initiative. They fought, maybe not fight, I don't want to say that. They advocated,
Yeah.
they supported the creation of what they call the Covenant Homeownership Act, which is to say, people that have been marginalized within the United States in the past, there are areas in our community that have had those covenants. So as I was mentioning, like those covenants that say, we don't allow Black people in our neighborhood. Well, now somebody can get up to $150,000 worth of a down payment assistance. And it's like a no interest bearing loan, essentially, that they can have that goes towards the down payment of a home, and that will help them generate wealth. So it's sort of an opportunity to sort of uplift folks. And I think within our community, I think the Native American community, I think we're going to see, a lot of opportunity there. And I think, Shenandoah, one of the things we were just talking about this is how do we help people understand and like elevate this, what it is, and do some like more marketing and promotion of it locally.
100%. Yeah. And it's Native Americans, it's Black Americans, it's Asian Americans, it's everybody that was affected by those covenants up through 1974, which is when the fair housing laws were implemented. So anybody that had ancestors, mothers, fathers, grandparents, whatever, that lived here prior to the Fair Housing Act have potentially the ability to receive these funds. I call it the Reparations Act.
Yeah, that's what it is. That's
Yeah.
right. Hey, I wanted to get to Beck. I know she's having trouble raising her hand, but I wanted to give her an opportunity.
Thank you. I work with Margot in the Napa Valley Neighborhood Association. We live in a mobile home park, and we've worked on residents buying mobile home parks. And I'm wondering how this housing shortage is viewed upon mobile home parks.
Yeah, good question. And this came to Planning Commission a couple years ago. There was a moratorium on selling mobile home parks in Bellingham because we really recognize what a truly important affordable homeownership opportunity it is. And it's a unique model. And, at one point it was allowed. And then as zoning codes changed and development styles changed, we've seen like no new mobile home parks being developed in many, many years. And so the risk is if whoever owns, in a mobile home park, there's an owner that owns the land, the individuals own their home, and then they pay rent to that homeowner or to the landowner. And the risk is that the landowner can increase the rent at any time, and a lot of folks being on a fixed income in those communities, and they can sell it and the costs go skyrocket, or they could sell it and tell everybody, you've got to leave. We're going to build a condo where your homes were. And so the risk was so much displacement. And so the city really worked. They created a moratorium for several years while they tried to come up with a good policy to help preserve the mobile home parks that we have. And now we need to work on how do we create more mobile home parks? And so where would they go and what would they look like? What kind of rules would we put in place? And, you know, mobile home, I think is a silly term.
Manufactured housing.
Yeah, there's nothing mobile about them other than when they get there. You don't pick them up and move them again. And so, you know, this is like, you know, they're not, I think there are some that have started on wheels, but for the most part, they all come and they get lifted and put on a foundation and they're there for until they're, you know, ready to be replaced, which is, you know, often way outliving the intended lifespan of their home because they are so affordable. And once they're there, it makes a good home for somebody. I grew up in a mobile home myself. And so I have quite the, I have an affinity for that too, as, you know, me and my partner and lots of other folks in my community grew up in those and know just how important it was for my family to have an affordable home for me and my 4 brothers and sisters and everybody else in there.
Is the property, I don't know, it's affordable. Yeah, I enjoy my park, but is the like land trust or anybody interested in ever buying the land? Because us as land renters, we can't do anything to maximize our what did I say? We can't add ADUs or anything.
Right. Well, and I think there's an organization, and I'm blanking on the name at the moment, but they are there specifically. It's a Washington state organization that is there to support mobile home park homeowners purchase land. And so they did that with the Samish Park recently.
Yeah.
So that was purchased. And they help them sort of figure out the model, the funding, the legal structure, and how those homeowners associations will work after they buy the land. I think it would be a great opportunity if the right opportunity came for Clipchamp Community Land Trust for us to get into, you know, a mobile home park. We certainly would be open to it. Right now, with 3 different developments going all at one time, we're just trying to keep the reins, the wheels on the bus and fund those projects that we have now because the funding is so tight. And so I think for mobile home parks, it's like, you know, essentially you become your own land trust. And that is, you know, the best case is where you have control over your own land. And that's the best case scenario.
I think we're nearing, Laura had one more question, but I think we're nearing our fourth, you know, the end of our session here. So if you want to go ahead and answer that one question, but in the meantime, I thank everybody.
Yeah, Laura just mentioned that it's the Northwest Cooperative Development Center that is helping folks purchase their mobile home parks. It's a great organization. I've met with the gals many times. They really are out there to support folks in you know, preserving that great affordable home.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and kind of wrap us up here. Then I thank everybody for participating, bearing with my my inexperience here. I appreciate Rose and all the information that she shared with us, and I'm sure that if you know, maybe another time after you've been at it a little while longer, we'll have you come back and answer some more questions.
Sure. I'd be glad to. And if anybody is interested in more information, feel free to connect with me. I'm Rose at clipchampclt.org.
Okay. Well, I will call it quits. You guys can all, and I have to figure out how to make sure that I get it posted to the cloud.
Thank you so much.